council. I'll press on then. If anybody is having any difficulty seeing and hearing, hopefully that you can communicate that to the hosts and we can get it resolved. But I'll work on the basis that we are all audible. To help with that, can I just remind everybody to switch their mobile devices to silent, please, and mute any notifications that your laptops or the devices you're using might have. The other thing, which it looks like you're all doing already, is unless you're actually addressing me or rather the inquiry, if you can mute your mics, and it's helpful to have the two advocates cameras on whilst they're participating, so that makes sense. And I think perhaps during the roundtable session, those who were sort of representing the two main parties, we'll come to that in a moment or two, if they can have their cameras on as well, that would help. Just in terms of a reminder of where we're up to, this is the fourth day of the inquiry, and all being well, the final day. I've heard from all of the witnesses did so last week, so that just leaves the roundtable session on conditions and the closing submissions of the two main parties. So that'll firstly be the council, and that'll be followed by those of the appellant. That's to say, and then if there are any applications for rules of costs, I'll hear those after that. I've not had any foreshadowed, but I'll double check after closings if there are any. Since I adjourned last week, last Thursday, I did as I said I would do. I've conducted my site visit. I've also received two versions of the conditions, one from the council and one from the appellant. I'll come back to those in a moment or two. Before I do, can I just confirm, and I think this question is already answered actually. Mr. Richards indicated he wouldn't be available today, and that the council would be represented by Odette Shalabai at council. You're there, Ms. Shalabai. So does that implies Mr. Richards is in court today, and you're representing the council?
Yes, that's right. And you can see and hear me okay?
I can. You sounded slightly distant. I don't know what that might just be my mic, so I'll turn you up. And if there's anything you can do at your end that might assist. But you were audible then. You just sounded slightly distant.
I'll find out if I can do anything to turn that up. Thank you, sir.
Okay, you were already better, and just by me turning up the volume, so it's probably a me thing, to be fair. Can I just double check how you prefer to be addressed? Is it Mrs., Miss, Ms?
Ms, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now, it's probably worth me saying, I'll occasionally sort of look like I'm not looking at the camera. It's because I'm not. It's because I'm looking at something else, and I've got a few monitors here that I'll be looking at, partly because that's where the information I'm referring to is, and I'll also be looking down to take notes and that kind of thing. So don't worry if I'm not always looking at the camera. I'm not distracted. It's simply because I'm looking at something I need to look at as part of the inquiry process. Before we move on to conditions, I'm not aware of any other housekeeping points, but is there anything from the main parties?
No, not from us, sir. I just have one query in terms of how we get our closing submissions to you.
Yeah.
I've got Holly Dutton's email address. Would that be the best person to send it to?
Yeah, absolutely. Holly is at work today, and will be manning her or womaning, whatever the term is, her device. So she's the case officer, and she'll pass on anything that comes in this morning. Hopefully it is just the closing scripts from you two.
Yeah.
So yeah, Holly's email address is the best one to send it to. Anything else before we move on to conditions? Okay, can I double? Yeah,
We're just going to ask if we could have a very short break between the conditions and the closings to just make some final comments on whatever happens in that conditions session. 10-15 minutes should be plenty.
Yeah, no, that sounds very sensible, so I'm happy to do that. And it's bins day this morning. I don't know whether you can hear the bin men, but it's I'll ignore it. It's not that distracting for me, but if it's distracting for you, let me know. It's on conditions. Can I just check who'll be taking a lead on those for the main parties?
So for the appellant, it's going to be Mr. Jackson, and I may say one or two things as well.
Of course, and for the council?
Similarly, it's going to be Mr. Wedderburn. I will be saying some things from time to time, and we also have on the call John Holmes from the council, who may need to step forward at a certain point if he hears something he's not entirely satisfied with, but Mr. Wedderburn is going to be leading.
Okay, that's helpful. Can I ask who Mr. Holmes is in terms of his role, please?
Mr. Holmes, do you want to very briefly turn your camera on and introduce yourself to the inquiry?
I think that's a good idea. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm the development manager for the council.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. That's a helpful clarification. Now, in terms of I suggest we just work through the conditions. Before we do, just a reminder for everybody's benefit. I said it on day one of the inquiry, but I think it bears repeating that it is absolutely standard practice to discuss potential conditions at inquiries and hearings. It's even done by correspondence for written representation appeals as well. To contemplate potential conditions in the event that an appeal were to be allowed. Of course, that doesn't imply that I've made up my mind on the case. I haven't. It's just something that I'm required to do as part of the inquiry process. Equally, it shouldn't be construed as affecting the council's position in any way. I'm sure if the council's position on the case has changed, they'd let me know. But I'm working on the basis it's their cases as it's been presented thus far through the inquiry process. I alluded to it earlier. I've got two sort of iterations of essentially the same document, but they're sort of change versions of a Word document. The latter of which came in this morning, about an hour ago. So I've not really had the opportunity to look at that in the way I would have liked. But thankfully, there are only 11 conditions. So what I suggest we do is work through them sequentially. I think I understand there's a break insofar as certain conditions are agreed between the main parties, whereas others aren't. I'll get that clarified in a moment to make sure I'm not barking at the wrong tree. And my thought is our time is probably best focused on those where there is remaining difference. Two things I want to really explore is what the differences are, because it's not that clear to me, and why. And what I'm hoping for out of this process is perhaps by close of play tomorrow is for a single document that both parties sort of agree on. And what I mean by agree on is identifying areas of disagreement, a sort of Scott type table with and if there are alternative wordings put forward from the two parties, then it should include those, and a bit of text explaining where the differences lie. And I think there's been a lot of work done on this evidently, and it's really just a case of capturing it in a clear-cut way, because I'm afraid, to my eye anyway, the track change version of what I've got that doesn't quite do that. But I'm sure all will become clear once we go through them. Okay, on that basis, we'll plough through them progressively. I think perhaps for I'm going to use the version that came through this morning, but I think the appellant has had sort of the last imprint on, if I can call it that. But I'll also have to hand the version that came through yesterday from a council, really just to help everybody, well, help me and everybody else sort of to orientate themselves. So, am I right in saying, firstly, that conditions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 are agreed between the main parties?
Yes, you are right, sir.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Easton. Mr. Wedderburn, your hand's up. I think for the roundtable session, Mr. Wedderburn, there's not that many people who are going to be involved, so I appreciate your politeness in putting your hand up. It's welcome, but I think you can probably just chip in. So, Mr. Wedderburn, when you're ready. Oh, you're muted, by the way.
Sorry, sir, I apologise. Yes, just perhaps as a point of clarification, condition 3 appears in the initial list of conditions agreed between the parties on the council's version. You'll see on the later version that Serco sent through that you've now received that one is agreed. The change there is more of a housekeeping matter to bring the reason up to date with the deletion that's been made in the condition to referring to reinstating the building to its previous use. So yes, that one is agreed, despite the fact in the council's version there is some track changes text. Yeah.
No, I'd read it as such, but thank you for the clarification. I had noted the updated wording for the reason. Okay, well, let's
just on condition 3. I just explain, there's no magic in the 31st of July date. 2029 is the date when the lease entered into will expire. But what we thought, we don't mind having 31st of July, but in the event that you grant planning permission, it may be sensible just to put the date of your decision letter in that condition. We just wanted to alight upon a date, on the assumption that it might be there or thereabouts when you issue a decision letter.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for clarifying. I'll just make a note of that.
Sir, can I just check to see which schedule of conditions you're looking at? I'm mindful there have been a couple that have been floating about.
Yeah, well, I'll attempt to describe them. The one came from the council yesterday via email, and the other came from your side this morning. And I don't know when it emanated from your side. This is the difficulty, because I've not got the email to hand. I've just got the Word document, but it got to me at about 8:30 this morning.
What's the title of the document?
Let's have a look. It says draft conditions, final comments.
Okay, yeah, then that's the correct version.
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So to just to recap, conditions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 are agreed. Note your point, Mr. Easton, about the date on condition 3, and your point, Mr. Wedderburn, explaining what the track change point was from a council. I think merely an update on the reason. I'll just recap for benefit of anybody who's not seen these conditions what they are in terms of headlines. The first relates to condition 1, I should say, relates to the sort of standard commencement type condition. Obviously needs to be read in the context of the time limit condition, which is condition 3, which essentially reads, "The use hereby approved shall cease on the 31st of July 2029. Just go back to condition 2, that lists drawings that are proposed to be sort of fixed and complied with. Condition 4 would be a condition that would govern when works can take place on site. essentially from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening, Monday to Friday, and 8 till 2 on Saturdays, and preventing works on Sundays and bank holidays. That's construction works and deliveries during the construction phase. Condition 5 would limit bed spaces to the number which has been much discussed. That's 481. So no surprises there, I don't think, in terms of the number. And then condition 7 would be to control a scheme for CCTV and boundary treatment. If there were to be boundary treatment, that would be submitted to and approved by the council in writing, and secure its implementation, or at least that appears to be its objective. I haven't got any.
So can I just comment?
Please do, yeah.
For those watching, there is a copy of this now on the council's website of the latest conditions, so people can follow along if that assists them.
That's helpful, thank you. I don't have it to hand, but I remember there was a core document number set aside for that. Does anybody have to hand what that was, just to help people orientate themselves if anybody does want to follow along?
I think it's C11.
C11. Okay, that's helpful, thank you. So that's core document C11 if anybody does want to follow these. Yeah, I didn't have anything else on conditions 1 to 5 inclusive, or condition 7. So I suggest we just move on to the remaining conditions if everybody's agreeable to that. Okay, so condition 6. The version I saw yesterday, it implied that the appellant was keen to delete that. The version I got this morning from the appellant includes it, but a sort of an amended version. But probably start with you, Mr. Jackson. What can you enlighten me on?
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks, sir. Yeah, that's correct. Initially, we were pursuing for that condition to be removed, and for the intention of that condition to be captured within condition 9, which relates to the management plan for the site. We've now accepted that condition 6 should stay, and we've just provided some slightly amended wording.
Okay, and Mr. Wedderburn, what's your position on? Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you considered a condition 6 was necessary, so presumably that's, as a matter of principle, welcome that the appellant is no longer seeking its omission. A, have I got that right? And B, what do you say about the wording in the version that I now have?
Yes, sir, thank you. I mean, firstly, just to confirm that the council would see the provisions within condition 6 as important in terms of the provision of an actual scheme of improvement to the open space. That would be for the benefit of the occupants. Yeah, but it also plays to the council's wider concerns about if there isn't good facilities in terms of open space within the site, it is more likely to be pressure on surrounding areas, and indeed that the groups might gather. But fundamentally, we had the concern that if you conflate it with the management plan condition, condition 9, that's likely to complicate matters of discharge. But fundamentally, if Serco are now happy to see condition retained, we welcome that. Your question about the specifics of the latest amendments that Mark Jackson has put before you, sir, the changes delete the words layout and specification in line 2 of that document. If perhaps you have it in front of you.
I do.
We see those words as absolutely, operational there. Replacing it with management clearly is, in our view, a weakening. We do note that in initial layout, the word layout appears in line 4, but prefacing it, the word initial sounds more like it's indicative, or that it's going to be lacking any significant detail. So from the council's point of view, we don't think it does the things that the council would like to see happen, both for the welfare of the occupants and for those other issues that I mentioned earlier.
So I can deal with the amended wording because it was my amended wording. Our concern was that if the scheme at its inception requires a detailed layout and specification, and that detailed layout and specification has to be maintained for the duration of the use, it would prevent any form of flexibility. You recall from the evidence that the population of Stafford Court is going to change, so it may well be that there might be 3 or 4 months where the predominant number of people are families, and so the open space needs to be sufficiently flexible to respond to the individual needs of individual cohorts. Say, for example, an area set aside for a children's play area, and there were very few children there at the particular time, that area may well be wasted. So our anticipation in terms of referring to management and initial layout is that it makes it very clear how the space is going to be managed and managed flexibly. So that's why we removed the layout and specification, because it fixes an element that should really be flexible.
Okay, I understand the points. I've just noticed every time I sort of lean over, part of me disappears. My apologies. I'm not sure if there's much that can be done about that, but I hope you can bear with me on that. Okay, well, I understand the respective points, and as I said before, I'm going to give an opportunity for really to get together and draw all this together into some form. I would suggest a Scott type table, which just sets out for the respective positions, and if agreement can still be reached, then fantastic. But if you still disagree, that's understandable. You don't have to agree on conditions, but it is important that I can understand what the differences are and why. But I think you've done that. So unless there's anything else on condition 6, I think we can move on. Please.
I mean, one suggestion to allow that flexibility, but to keep control with the council to ensure there are suitable facilities for children and the like, might be to include a clause such as unless otherwise agreed in writing by the council, after saying that layout has to be complied with for the duration. So something that can be considered by the parties.
Okay, well that's food for thought for probably all of us between now and for you, 2 parties, when you're contemplating whether there is any extra common ground that can be found, and I'd encourage you, if you can find extra common ground, to find it, and if you can't, then that's something that I can take into account should I need to. Okay, we move on to condition 8 because we've already dealt with condition 7. Now, I'm not all that clear on the parties' positions on this. I'm juggling here. I'm looking at the 2 versions. Let me have another look.
So my understanding is we're agreed on that, and the only side is the trigger clause, which is medical room should be operational prior to the first residential occupation of the development. In other words, it may be, the medical room doesn't have to be available for use until people start living there.
Right. So, well, we'll hear from Mr. Wedderburn, but in the iteration that I've received this morning, the council's, the appellant's version, that version's agreed. Is that right, Mr. Wedderburn?
Yes, sir. The council's concerns were twofold: that the medical room should be equipped and also that it should be ready for occupation. And the later version of the Serco comments on the draft conditions I agree, seem to have accepted those main points. And yes, it's that point about the trigger. And from my part, I think that sounds sensible.
Okay, so as far as the council is concerned, the matters, this wording resolves the tension that existed before, and it's now a matter of common ground. This wording. Don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's what I'm hearing. Is that right, Mr. Wedderburn? That was a point to you.
Yes, yeah. Sorry. We discussed these conditions, the council, and also the council's barrister, and yes, we've no further concerns if that's the wording that is to go forward. A condition along those lines is acceptable. It's
common ground and it's agreed. Okay, so we can move it to the other. If I've got two columns, agreed and not agreed, I can move it to the agreed column. Okay, that's helpful. We can move on to actually before we do, let me just reread this to make sure I've understood it properly. Yeah, it's similar to the earlier iteration. Okay, we'll move on to suggested condition 9. I think there's a relationship between this one and the one we discussed earlier. Was it 6? This sort of the flexibility point. Where are we on this now? Is this now agreed with the amended wording, or is there still a tension?
So I think as I understand it, and Mr. Jackson will correct me if I'm wrong, there are 2 points to consider here. First of all, the extent, the last bullet point. So the management plan needs to include all of the things in the bullet point. And as far as I can see, the last bullet point, which talks about scheduled activities to be carried out within the outdoor and indoor recreation space and off-site, I think we've inserted before off-site examples of activities that will be available off-site.
Yeah, that's correct. That's the only difference between us. We've taken out reference to facilities. That was a link back to the condition 6, which we're now agreeable to.
So don't want to put words in your mouth, but in summary, from your appellant's point of view, because of the change to condition 6, you think this wording now does what the council is seeking? I see Mr. Wedderburn shaking his head, but I just want to understand the appellant's position, and then I'll attempt to understand the council's position.
So our original view was that the operational management plan could include everything, including what's now included within condition 6. But we've taken the council's comments on board, and there's a separate condition in relation to management and layout of the internal open space. So I said there are 2 things. The other thing which I think is an issue is how you word the requirements for a review. And I suggested some amended wording, which I don't think has found its way into the final version. Because the version you've had, I think, in terms of implementation, do you have the SOMP shall be reviewed and submitted to the local authority for written approval no later than 12 months after first occupation, and then SOMP shall be complied with the duration of the use hereby permitted?
Yeah, that wording follows the bullet points. I do have that. Yeah,
so I think Mr. Wedderburn will explain, but I think the council's position in relation to that was that the use of the expression no later than 12 months after first occupation could potentially allow the appellant to carry out a review 2 weeks after it starts. My understanding from the council's position is that they want the operational management plan to be running for 12 months to see how it goes, and then for the review to take place then. So my suggested amended wording was this: the approved SOMP shall be reviewed and submitted to the local planning authority for its written approval 12 months following first occupation of the development hereby permitted. So it's fixing the date. So in other words, it's not before 12 months, it's after. And then the SOMP, including any approved amendments following a review, shall be complied with for the duration of the development hereby permitted.
Okay, I understand the point, Mr. Wedderburn. Is that a fair summary of your the council's concerns? Is there, and if not, why not? Are there any other points, and would that revised suggested condition Mr. Easton's just outlined, would that address any concerns you might have?
So yes, I mean, skipping over the earlier issues with regard to condition 6, assuming that condition 6 is in place. The concern that the council had was correctly outlined to you by Serco's barrister. It would be the case that we're absolutely clear. I think this came up a number of times during the inquiry hearings, that we'd want lessons learned, was the phrase used, to be taken into account, that the management plan not be a static document, that it would therefore require a reasonable space of time to consider what issues might have arisen. So yes, we'd want the 12 months that was just put to you. And I think we'd also want reference to it then being complied with for the duration of the use on the end of that section as well. But other than that, I can see Adet is also nodding that does represent the council's position.
Okay, that's helpful. Well, it sounds like there may be scope for further common ground. Just I don't think there's any point in dwelling on it now. It's probably something that parties can take away and work up in the next iteration. I've already alluded to this sort of schedule type arrangement. Great if you can find common ground and a common wording, but if you can't, again, just identify what the differences are and explain why. And if I have to, I'll take a view of that. Is there anything else on condition 9 before we move on?
No.
No. Okay, helpful, thank you. Condition 10. Again, I think perhaps some of the principles here are similar to ones we've already discussed. It concerns well, it relates to occupation and provision of indoor what's described as amenity space of not less than 90 square meters. I think the council were concerned, or rather keen, to ensure that was provided in a single room, I think, and we're concerned that the wording of the condition may not secure that. It could be spread. Is that the gist of it, Mr. Wedderburn?
Yes, sir. I would agree that the point of difference here is over whether the space be provided as one room. That was the point that had been deleted in the latest version that you'll see.
Okay.
And so our concern was in respect of activities that we've heard that Serco want to provide, such as the police coming to give talks about integration into the community. Those would want to be for large groups of residents to be effective. And in the current wording proposed by the appellant, what you could have is a series of small medical size doctors' rooms that all add up together to make that square footage. So yeah, our concern was to ensure one room that you can have big talks, educational seminars, and that kind of activity.
If I can help there, sir, the 90 square meters essentially comes from taking a cluster out of use as a residential cluster. It's approximately 90 square meters there or thereabouts. And so the logic would be that a single cluster on the ground floor would be used for the purposes of essentially multi-use. We're not suggesting that it would be as cellular as they currently are. The concern was essentially to say you need a room of 90 square meters or 900 square foot, which is essentially a very large room. And there'll be no doubt times when that functional space could be used for more than one group. For example, it might be where kids are having reading lessons, and then equally where someone wants to watch telly in another room. So I think it's sensible, but recognise that there's perhaps a concern over having lots of little rooms, and that wouldn't perform the role that either party wanted. But I'm sure there's a better middle ground. We wouldn't want to commit to such a large room, if that makes sense.
Councillor's comment, if I may, the councillor's comment on that would be that fundamentally some of the activities, and it might, as well as the Adette's description of talks from outside, it might also be social gatherings for the benefit of the occupants, they would fundamentally require the larger room. So I suppose our suggestion, if it helps, would be that potentially in hotels, conferences, schools, you might have dividers, some way of splitting rooms up, but fundamentally the council would suggest we'd still want to see the larger space.
So if I can just add to that, I think to restrict it in the way that Mr. Jackson was just suggesting would restrict the amount of activities that the type of activities that could take place.
Okay, that I understand the respective positions. Again, I sense there may be not so much scope for common ground to be found here, unless there's a sort of softening of the parties' positions, but overnight. But if you know, additional common ground can be found, great. But if as I suspect it won't be, if you could set out your respective positions, but I've got a good understanding of it now, so that's appreciated. Is there anything else before we move on to condition 11?
So no, it's unrelated to conditions. I don't know whether this has appeared on other people's screens, but I've just had a notification pop up saying streaming is turned off. I've no idea whether it was whether this session and the closing submissions were meant to be streamed more broadly than the attendees, but at least my computer's telling me that the stream is turned off.
Yeah, I can see the same message,
Yeah.
and my understanding was that it would be.
Yeah, I've just checked. It is still streaming, so
It is.
Continue. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's reassuring. That was a sort of disembodied voice. Can I just double check who said that?
Sarah Warren. I'm the IT technician at Stafford County.
Okay, that's helpful, Ms. Warren. Thank you for clarifying. We'll work on that basis that it's still streaming. But if it's a point well worth making though, Mr. Easton. Thank you for flagging it. If there are any issues, if somebody could let me know. But I'll work on the basis that we are still streaming. Okay. I think we're there on 11. Sorry, on 10. Let me just return to my notes. Yeah, just one left. Condition 11.
So I think that's agreed.
It is it? Is that right, Mr. Wedderburn?
I'm sticking my neck out, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it is.
Yes, if I could come in at this point, if you've got the latest version, sir, of Serco's version of the draft conditions, that one has taken out, has accepted the wording that the council inserted, which was "and shall be maintained as such for the duration of the use permitted." If that represents the appellant's position, then yes, the point of difference disappears.
So can I just, I mean, with the risk of sounding overly picky, I wouldn't necessarily describe keeping the rooms of those sizes as maintaining them, as a slightly different meaning. Can I suggest retained as such? That was certainly a suggestion I made on one of the iterations.
How does that strike you, Mr. Wedderburn, that particular wording?
I think he's saying yes, but he's on mute, Mr. Wedderburn.
Ah, yes.
I've no comment on that change. If colleagues are content, then yes.
Okay, but again, probably want to just get your heads together on overnight and to pick up in the final iteration. But it sounds like the principal matters are now agreed. So that's helpful. Thank you. Is there anything else on 11 before we draw this session to a close? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll pause then. Shalabai, you asked for a short break between this session and you delivering the council's closings. 15 minutes suffice?
Certainly, 10 would do, but 15.
Okay. No, I'm happy with 10. Is everybody else happy with a 10-minute break? Okay. And for once, the clock is kind to me. It's 10 past, so we can. I can easily do the arithmetic. We'll adjourn now. It's 10 past 10. We'll resume at 20 minutes past 10.
So before we do, can I just check
Okay.
whether Miss Shelley, if you can email me a copy of her closing submissions, because 10 minutes will give me a time to print them out, because I like looking at them in hard copy.
Yes, I'll send them now to Mr. Wedderburn to submit to Holly Dutton and to yourself.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. What I'll do, I won't leave the meeting. I'll just turn my camera off, mute my mic, and turn my my sound off. But we are now adjourned. Thank you. It's now 20 past. The inquiry's resumed. I'm pleased to say I've received both closing scripts and been able to open them. So all being well, we'll be able to get on. Are you now in a position, Ms. Shalabai, to deliver your client's closing, please?
Yes, sir.
Okay, when you're ready then, please.
In opening, we noted the apparent tension between the immigration and asylum policy of the Home Office and planning policy. The Home Office is trying to stop the boats, and part of the strategy is, apparently, to accommodate asylum seekers in relatively basic conditions and keep them economically inactive on subsistence incomes while their claims are determined. In an individual case, this may take over 18 months. There has been no policy or guidance from DLUC, the department, to inform the planning system as to how it should react to the Home Office strategy, and in particular, whether the policy to seek to deliver sustainable communities should be applied as we would to any other proposed form of specialist residential accommodation. So far as the participants of the inquiry are concerned, this is the first appeal of this nature. The number of asylum seekers requiring accommodation has grown exponentially in recent years. The Home Office has commissioned the appellant, Serco, amongst others, to find and run the accommodation needed. The potential sources comprise houses and flats rented from private landlords, together with hotels and converted institutional accommodation blocks. The use of hotels in particular has caused public concern, and the Home Office is concerned about the cost and value of money for the taxpayer. Far-right groups also regard asylum seekers being accommodated in hotels, while they feel left behind as unacceptable, and some serious public order incidents have resulted. Accommodating asylum seekers, particularly single young men, in hotels with few on-site facilities and with a limited income to engage off-site means these men with little to do have understandably taken to hanging around in groups in public. As shown by local people who have spoken in this case, this has the potential to cause concern for some of the local population, potentially leading to undesirable consequences. This is particularly acute where the accommodation contains a large number of residents and is located in an urban area without much on-site amenity space. The Home Office now seems to recognise that a change of tack is needed. Recently, it has announced new proposals to house large numbers of asylum seekers in former MOD sites and the like. There, the approach is one of self-sufficiency, with more facilities and amenities provided on-site to, and I quote from the Home Office document, minimise the impact on local communities and services. The use of hotels in urban areas in particular is to be wound down. Against that background, the identification of the appeal site with its limited amenity space and lack of facilities as a candidate for a 481-person asylum seeker accommodation seems something of an anachronism. It is part of a concept that has had its day. For reasons which will be explored further, it is not an appropriate component of a sustainable community in this part of the town of Stafford. First heading, the property and its residents' routine. There will be up to 481 bed spaces for a maximum of 481 people. Up to 171 will be used for initial accommodation by single adults and/or families, and families would occupy a whole cluster of 4 or 5 bedrooms, although we note that the split of IA and dispersed accommodation could vary over time and is not to be controlled by the planning system. 310 spaces would be used for dispersed accommodation by single adults only, in clusters of 4 or 5 bedrooms. As well as bedrooms, each cluster has a communal kitchen, dining and lounge space, and there'd be no TV or broadband provided in a cluster. Cluster kitchens will be fitted with washing machines. There'll be no use of the former student communal laundry. The clusters that are used for IA and for DA will be a matter for Serco's operational judgment, we understand. The number of single males, single females and families will vary over time, and again there's no proposed control by the planning system, for example over the number of single males at any one time. This too will be left to the judgment of Serco and the Home Office. Bedrooms and internal living spaces will meet required HMO standards, and Serco has no intention to change that and should not do so. While the design and access statement stated that what internal space the IA facility would provide for residents and internal layout plans were produced for each floor, the appellant has now indicated it wishes to retain flexibility over the final internal layout, and so a condition is proposed, as discussed earlier, governing the size of the rooms. The outdoor recreational area is effectively the internal courtyard. Its use will be the subject of the management plan. Well, earlier we've now agreed that's to be subject to condition 6. Its use will be controlled by condition, and the council considers its layout should be too. The life and routine of an asylum seeker living on the appeal site was confirmed by Ms. Dyche. A person will be allocated a bedroom in a single sex or family cluster. They do their own cooking, cleaning and laundry. All food and supplies have to be purchased from the £45 per week allowance each received, according to the appellant, a very limited income. If they were provided with meals centrally, the allowance would be just £9.10 per week. That's an indication of the amount available for all non-food expenditure. Residents do not drive. Motorised travels largely by public transport, which must be paid for. The shuttle service promised in the consultation leaflet will not, after all, operate. Those with mobility issues may be provided discretionary free transportation, and some general transport will be offered to legal, Home Office and medical appointments. Food will be purchased locally. There's a small co-op unit store at Brereton Way, about a 14-minute walk away, but the town centre Asda store, the largest store, is about 2.25 kilometres away, 35-minute walk. No mobile phone equipment or Wi-Fi is provided, and individuals are responsible for paying any such costs or bills. Asylum seekers are not allowed to work to earn money, and residents will have very little, if any, disposable income for travel, recreation, gym, sport, meals out, cinema, pubs or holidays. Recreational activity will be effectively limited to that which is free or that which is provided on site. The application regarded the site as being in a sustainable location, in part as a result of the services and facilities nearby. However, it is unlikely that residents will be able to afford to patronise most of them. Although the original floor plans did not provide for shared internal amenity space, Ms. Dyche suggested that a TV may be provided in a communal common room. Despite an expressed attention to facilitate, Serco will not commit at this stage to providing anything in particular by way of recreational facilities or activities. The expectation is to make provision as on other sites, largely through the voluntary sector. No analogous volunteer groups have been approached in Stafford. This would only happen if planning permission was granted, we were told. The detail is to be left to the management plan to be agreed by condition. While not allowed to take up employment, residents are permitted to volunteer. There's no indication as yet as to how many will be able to or wish to do so, nor who in Stafford will organise it. This again is a matter to be left to the management plan. Residents will be permitted to form a team to join a local football league. While Serco has apparently sponsored teams in the past, providing kit, again there's no commitment to do so here, and it's unclear where practice would take place and how other expenses would be met. When residents need a break from the four walls of the cluster or the confines of the on-site courtyard, they will head off-site and hang around. There's nothing else to do. That is what happens elsewhere. Mr. Jackson opines in his rebuttal proof that the accommodation at the appeal site would be better than at hotels on the basis of there being more space for a wider range of activities. However, Mr. Jackson accepted that some hotels run by Serco have more extensive grounds and some have leisure facilities included. In any event, it's submitted that even if the Stafford Court facility offers more than some or even many hotels, that does not mean the offer is adequate in planning terms. Hotel conversions not requiring planning permission will not have had rigorous independent assessment against national planning policy. While the council is not promoting any other particular alternative site, the reasons why the appeal site were selected are instructive. Serco told us that the configuration of self-contained clusters are ideal and flexible, and that the site was regarded as the most suitable for Serco's needs. for the middle and east of England. The design and access statement explained the site selection process. The process began in January 2020, with contact being made with agents and groups in the property sector. Only 8 candidate sites were identified, all owned by the private sector. All but the appeal site were discounted. Some were said to be too expensive or not commercially viable. No indication of the parameters applied was given. Others were said to be likely to take too long to be delivered. There's some irony given that we're now 3 years on and the Stafford Court site is still not delivered. Stafford Court was the only site on the list where the borough was not contributing asylum seeker accommodation. At that time, the first contact with the council was in October 2020. By then the site had already been selected. Nevertheless, pre-application consultation, it was called, was carried out in February and March 22, with an opportunity for feedback. No changes to the proposal at all followed. This proposed consultation was simply an exercise to gather comments that Serco could then try to respond to in the material supporting the application. Local people do not feel it has even done that. The design and access statement explains that the Home Office asks all local authorities to facilitate dispersed accommodation for asylum seekers. The Home Office has determined that what is fair is a ratio of 1 to 200 of the population. On that basis, the Home Office position is that Stafford must facilitate 684 places for dispersed accommodation. The population of England is estimated to be 56.5 million. A ratio of 1 to 200 indicates 282,700 dispersed accommodation places should be provided nationally, which is almost double the current requirement. There is no evidence that anyone approached Stafford Borough Council asking for local views on where or how a requirement for 684 places of DA might be best met in the borough. Instead, the approach has been unashamedly top-down. The newest public sector sites being selected are far different. The fact sheets we've explored during the inquiry show that the sites are to be as self-sufficient as possible, again quoting, to minimise the impact on local communities and services. This means that on-site catering, recreational and cultural activities, shops, faith and worship space, and medical facilities will all be provided to meet essential needs of residents and allow them to occupy their time constructively. Those running the sites are to work closely with local stakeholders. There'll be 24/7 security. Paragraphs 92 and 130F of the NPPF require planning decisions to aim to achieve healthy, inclusive and safe places, which are safe and accessible so that crime and disorder and the fear of crime do not undermine the quality of life or community cohesion. Paragraph 130 requires planning decisions to ensure development will function well, create places that are inclusive and accessible, promote health and well-being, provide a high standard of amenity for future and existing users. For the reasons we explained following, this is not going to be achieved at Stafford Court on the basis of the appeal proposals. The next heading, fear of crime. Public concern as opposed to actual evidence of threats to public safety can be a material consideration in planning decisions. In Newport Borough Council and Secretary of State for Wales, the Court of Appeal overturned an award of costs that had been made against the local planning authority by the Secretary of State at appeal on the basis that the authority had acted unreasonably in taking account of the public perception of danger emanating from a chemical waste treatment plant, which was unsupported by evidence. The court held it was a material error of law to conclude that a genuinely held public concern, public perception of danger, which was unfounded, could never amount to a valid ground for refusal. The issue of the relevance of public concern to planning also arose in the case of West Midlands Probation Committee. This case concerned an appeal by the West Midlands Probation Committee against the refusal of planning permission for an extension to a bail and probation hospital, the inspector having found that the extension would be likely to increase significantly the disturbance caused to nearby residents. The Court of Appeal dismissed the appeal. The concerns held by residents were justified because of a history of disturbing behaviour. Finally, the case of the Crown and Broadland District Council establishes that behaviour associated with the use of land for a particular purpose relates to the character of the use of the land and is capable of being a material planning consideration. It was also held that public fears or concerns can be a material consideration if they have land use consequences. In that case, fear of crime resulting in reduced pedestrian journeys and additional car trips to and from school. So in light of those authorities, in this case, it is relevant to ask, first, what evidence is there that conduct by residents of asylum seeker accommodation will or is likely to increase crime in the area or be a cause of public concern? What evidence is there that the presence of asylum seeker accommodation will increase crime in the area by non-residents? What evidence is there that local residents fear such a rise in crime? If there is no evidence to objectively justify such fear, is the fear nevertheless genuinely held? It's fair to observe that the local residents' principal concerns are for the conduct of groups of single young men facing desperation, boredom or frustration, which will not be mitigated by the circumstances in which they will be kept at the appeal site. There's also a fear of crime by two categories of non-residents. First, the far right, whose protests either cause or are taken advantage of and result in public disorder and damage to property. And secondly, criminal gangs who could seek to prey on the residents, luring them into using or supplying drugs or into modern slavery. The consultation response of the police's designing our crime officer is evidence of similar fears. It provided as follows. First, that the safeguarding of the occupants is of the utmost priority. There is a prospect of community tension. That is why the site is to be made secure. The message is that the general public must be kept out. Secondly, the security recommendations, in reality requirements, are also illuminating. Restrictions to keep the public out, communal entrance doors to be of a particular standard to prevent them being forced open. Thirdly, emergency plans are required for external encroachment by those with, and I quote, malicious intent. And also emergency plans, again I quote, for occasions where occupants may act inappropriately, presumably out of boredom or protest at their conditions. CCTV is said by the police to be especially useful for issues amongst the occupants. Police also note fears for the personal safety of occupants because they're unable to work. There is a risk of exploitation, labour, criminal and sexual. In that context, the suggestion that there is no evidence to suggest an increase of crime is simply not credible. Serco itself has carried out a risk assessment that reached some similar conclusions. There is ample evidence that the fear of crime exists. First, the police consultation response accepts it exists. Secondly, it's contained in the more than 1,000 written responses to the planning application and appeal. Thirdly, further evidence in the form of the communications with Councillor Beattie and her evidence to this inquiry. Fourthly, the activity of far-right groups at planning committee and at other locations in the country. Fifthly, in the local MP's letter to PINS, the local MP stated, "You may be aware we currently have approximately 70 young men accommodated in the village of Penkridge. I've already had numerous complaints about men hanging around the local schools and following girls home. The harassment of women while going about their daily business and various other problems. This illustrates perfectly why the Beaconside site is so appropriate, and I fear serious implications if it goes ahead." That's what the local MP has submitted to this application. And the final piece of evidence of genuine fear of crime is the evidence given to this inquiry. In addition to the hundreds of written responses to the planning application and appeal, about 30 local people told the inquiry orally about their concerns, with many stating that the proposed development would alter their behaviour and their children's behaviour. The most common concern raised was over the safety of unaccompanied children walking to school in close proximity to large numbers of bored young men from unknown backgrounds with very little money, activities, space or places to go. Residents' concerns were exacerbated by the recognition that some asylum seekers may be dealing with serious mental health issues, including trauma. Mrs. Shelley told the inquiry that were the development to go ahead, she'd be worried about her two vulnerable autistic children walking to school. Mr. D. Harland agreed that some parents would feel their children are unsafe walking and would in future drive to and from school. Mr. Connolly said he'd no longer feel comfortable with his 12-year-old daughter walking to school with her friends. And similarly, Mr. Calladine expressed his fears for the safety of his 2 young daughters that attend the Western Road Academy walking to and from school. Another speaker, Ms. E. Dugmore, raised concerns for her own safety as a single woman walking or cycling at night. She explained her fear of coming across a group of unknown men with whom she could not communicate. In her words, the fear of crime is sometimes even worse than the actual crime. I don't know if I'll be attacked or assaulted. That's a horrible way to live life. Why should I have to change my behaviour? Some local people also fear that residents would be tempted to crime through desperation and poverty. They pointed out that asylum seekers must survive on an allowance of just £45 per week for food, clothes, toiletries, phone, travel and activities. Mrs. Kay Dugmore, who lives in what she described as a fairly rural and isolated location by a popular footpath, was concerned that residents may be tempted into petty theft of food from her garden. Similarly, Mr. Wilson told the inquiry of his worry that asylum seekers' need for food could result in street robberies or stealing food from shops. Thirdly, local people expressed concerns about the risk of increased crime from non-residents through public disorder, violent protest and attacks on the asylum seekers themselves. Mr. Corley fears Stafford Court might become a target for far-right extremist groups. Ms. Trowbridge, a former borough councillor, noted the events in the town centre of Mechanic and that Serco had not prevented such issues occurring. She also queried why it was necessary for security measures around Stafford Court and why indeed there is currently a fence erected. She noted that some asylum seekers may be vulnerable, including those with mental health issues, and that they may not be safe from being attacked. Ms. Ailcock, on behalf of Stafford Welcomes Refugees, expressed concern that young asylum seekers wandering around with nothing to do, and I quote, will be sitting ducks for far-right activists in the region. In its opening points, it was submitted by Serco that there were 3 gateways which must be passed before the fear of crime could be taken into account. First, the fear of crime must be objectively justified. The Council submits it has been sufficiently, even though that is not a clear and consistent requirement in the case law. It is based on experience elsewhere, where some of the problems feared have been manifest, including far-right protests and counter-protests in nearby Cannock. Secondly, it must have a reasonable basis. It has. It's based on matters identified by Serco and by the police, by the local MP and in media reports. And thirdly, it must relate to the use of land. It does. It is the conditions under which the residents are proposed to be kept, the site's location, particularly in relation to schools, that underpins local concerns. This appeal has demonstrated the importance of selecting the right site in planning terms. The site search focused on Serco's operational requirements. Only once the decision was made did Serco think of engaging with the local community and legitimate planning considerations. The next heading, social inclusion. As the Serco opening points recognise, there is some overlap with fear of crime. The aim at paragraphs 92 and 130 of the MPPF is to integrate, so far as possible, the residents into the local community. There are a number of real obstacles to achieving the result that Serco desires. First, the sheer number of residents, up to 481 of them. Secondly, Serco relies on the support of local people, charities and community groups. As the inquiry heard, a notable group of local people are already predisposed to fear, in particular single men, but some support for families has been expressed. The inquiry heard from Ms. Ailcock, again of Stafford Welcomes Refugees, who expressed grave concern at the prospect of another 481 refugees in the town. She said they were already stretched, helping the 77 at Bridgewood House, and described the appeal proposal as a recipe for disaster. Serco has not proposed any organised and funded support, as any normal appellant would when faced with a planning impact that required mitigation. It does the Home Office's bidding, which seems to be to provide very little. Councillor Beattie expressed a preference for pepper potting refugees throughout the town, based on respective research and reports. Serco doubts this would be possible for 481 people. If that's the case, Councillor Beattie's preference was for the new self-sufficient, larger institutions, where everything is provided on site, which the government now sees the advantage of to minimise the impact on local communities and services. The appeals scheme, effectively a large facility without self-sufficiency, is the worst of all worlds. Next heading, local health service resources. The Council's decision notice averred that the application fails to demonstrate the proposal would not lead to a detrimental impact on local health service resources. The members were told in the supplementary officer report that the County Council had stated that asylum seekers in the DA will increase demand on local services. Asylum seekers are likely to have more challenging health needs than students, and the local health providers should confirm what impacts need to be mitigated. In respect of health services, the design and access statement stated the following. In respect of IA residents, which includes families, these will be registered with an on-site provider. Local services will only be needed in an emergency. They will receive on-site healthcare, or it might be off-site. Funding flows down from the Department of Health. There'll be referral pathways from GPs to other medical services. These will be local services. High rate of access is likely to be required. In terms of DA residents, single persons only, these will receive a health assessment at the start of their stay. Provision will be met off-site in local facilities. Although Serco is working with the Home Office to see if it can be brought on-site, this can already happen as it does in Coventry. In this event, health services would be commissioned from a local GP practice. Overall, on-site facilities would be provided in the form of a medical room under the contract with the Home Office. This is also to be conditioned. It is therefore plain that local GP and other local medical services will be called on. First, human resources, so doctors and nurses, will be required both on and off site. These will be the very same staff as at existing local services. The appellant has not shown that staff for the new residents will not be simply diverted from treating the existing population. Secondly, rooms in off-site facilities will also be needed. The Clinical Commissioning Group first consultation response indicated that the local practice currently has a shortage of gross internal area and clinical rooms to serve the existing population. Subsequent consultation response expressed satisfaction with the on-site medical room, but Serco has not responded at all to the shortage of space and resources that DA residents will call on, nor has it been demonstrated that additional staff will be recruited. Serco continues to rely on the proposition that the impact on health services will not be as great as when the students were in residence. This is wholly misguided. There is no prospect of the student use resuming. The current impact is almost nil. Students in any significant number were last in residence 5+ years ago. Since then, new housing development of circa 620 dwellings close to the appeal site has taken up any spare capacity created by the students' departure. Indeed, the number of new houses exceeds the number of student accommodation bed spaces, and as most of the new housing is family housing, the number of residents would be 3 times that the number of students. The need for medical attention is also greater in the asylum seeker accommodation than students. And finally, mental health issues are likely to be greater amongst the asylum seeker population too. The above premise is plainly misguided, as the ICB has made clear. Turning then to conditions, a number of small points remain between the parties with respect to the conditions necessary. I don't propose to go through these again here, as further schedule will be submitted tomorrow. Turning last to the planning balance, the appeal scheme accords with the development plan. However, as material considerations, the Council relies on the matters discussed above and in the reasons for the refusal: local concern and the fear of crime, the lack of social inclusion, and the lack of a clear demonstration that there'll be no impact on local health services, as outweighing the presumption in favour of a permission. The appeal scheme is too big. It is located too close to schools, and the site lacks, in particular, suitable and sufficient outdoor recreation space that is obviously required. All these points and more were put to Serco in the public consultation, but by then it was too late to influence the decision to abandon the scheme. Serco has found premises it regarded as ideal in terms of meeting the requirements of the Home Office contract. It is just a shame closer attention was not given as to whether or not it was a good site in planning terms. If the Home Office wants Stafford Borough Council to host up to 684 DA places, then it would do well to engage with the council as an equal partner to establish how and when that can be best achieved. So those are the council's closing submissions in this case.
Thank you, Ms Shalaby. Mr Easton, would you like a moment, or are you happy to deliver the appellant's closings?
I'm happy to carry on, sir, if everyone else
okay.
is. Oh,
yep. Well, we'll press on that basis then, please. Thank you.
Would it be possible to send me an electronic copy of your closing submissions? I haven't seen one, but I understand one's gone to the inspectorate.
One's gone to the inspectorate, one's gone to you, Mr Richards. You check your email.
Yeah. It hasn't come through.
Yeah, the version I had only came to me, but that's not to say it didn't go independently.
Okay. Oh. It's showing as sent. Do you want to just double check?
I mean, it's not come through. I just checked again. Is it possible to just try and send it again, or to send it to Mr Wedderburn or the council, because it just hasn't come through? I'm sorry, Mr Easton.
I've just sent it again.
Yeah.
Still no sign, no?
No. But could you send it to Mr Wedderburn in case it's blocking the email, or you've got the wrong email, or that's just not coming through?
No, I've just replied to the email where you said, could I send you my closing submissions back in return? Perhaps I can ask one of my team to send a copy of my closing submissions to Mr Wedderburn.
Yes, if you could do that, that'd be helpful. I'm happy for you to start, but we do want to have a copy before we close today.
No, that sounds like a sensible way of doing it. Can I just check, Ms Shalaby, are you? It's always difficult to know where everybody is. Are you with the council's team?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So we're then relying on another sort of bumping on. I mean, I'll
send Mr Jackson an email now, and maybe he could try and send it to me as Mr Easton starts.
Okay. I'm just wondering whether it's worth just taking a short break now, just because it's, you know, what's pot never boils, does it? It's
yeah. Should we just take 5 minutes, sir?
Yeah, let's do that, because I don't want you know, I don't want us to get to the end of closing and you not to have had it, Ms Shalaby. So we'll do that. We'll adjourn until the hour mark at 11 o'clock, and hopefully it will have found its way to you by then, Ms Shalaby. So we'll do that. We're adjourned until 11. Thank you.
No one in my team
Hello
has.
again. It's now 11. The inquiry is resumed. Any joy with the? No, still nothing. Goodness, that's puzzling.
I think Mr. Wedderburn said he spoke to Mr. Jackson, who was going to send it. But Mr. Wedderburn has still not got it, and I haven't.
Sorry, I was about to tell you were muted, and then I realised my I turned my volume down. Do you mind repeating that, Miss Shalaby? My apologies.
Yes, no worries. We still haven't got it. I really don't know what's happening, but Mr. Wedderburn hasn't had it, and I haven't had it.
That's extraordinary. But I don't want that to imply that I'm not believing anybody. It's obviously there's a technology glitch here. I am keen for it to be in front of you, Miss Shalaby, before so that you can follow it, as I've got a copy. Let's have another short adjournment, give ourselves till 10 past, and hopefully it can be sorted out. I shall get in touch with the case officer and ask them to send what's been sent to me to your side as well, and hopefully through various means we'll get it to you. But let's just have another 10 minutes. We'll adjourn now and resume at 10 past 11. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Have you got it, Odette?
Yes, just now we've got it. Thank you.
It's now 10 past 11. The inquiry is resumed. What news? Has it landed?
It has. Thank you, sir.
Thank goodness. My thanks to everybody who managed to make that happen. An unfortunate little wrinkle, but not to worry. Okay, Mr. Easton, can I hear your closing, please?
Thank you, sir. I'll stick to text, but I will need to depart on a number of occasions, but I'll give you due warning. In light of the way in which this inquiry has progressed, it's worth making a few introductory observations. First, this appeal will be determined by you, sir, an independent inspector appointed by the Secretary of State. The decision will be made by you, sir, on the basis of the evidence put before you. That decision must be based on the application of local and national policies and any other material considerations. The appellant, and we have no doubt that the council will agree, will accept that you'll discharge this duty with the utmost diligence and care, considering all of the evidence available. The outcome of the appeal is not, as some people put it in the inquiry, a done deal. Second, the appellant, the council and you, sir, will all be well aware of the strength of feeling amongst local residents who attended the inquiry. We recognise, of course, that further reassurance will be needed if the scheme goes ahead, and the appellants worked hard to provide that reassurance through the course of the application process and the inquiry. Nonetheless, the decision on this appeal has to be made within a well-established legal and policy framework and can't be determined on emotion alone. So it would have been tempting to leave the inquiry venue with a certain impression as to how people in Stafford view asylum seekers. However, it was striking on the first day that there was an important point of agreement between two individuals with opposing views as to the merits of the case. Both Councillor Beattie and Dr. Lloyd made persuasive points that the people of Stafford would be welcoming and compassionate towards any asylum seeker housed here. The community would reach out and provide what support it was able, a point echoed by Miss Elcock, a member of Stafford Welcomes Refugees. Again, even local residents who objected strongly to this particular scheme recognised the need to accommodate asylum seekers and to provide them with support. It may be unsurprising that there was agreement on this particular point because this country has a long history of welcoming asylum seekers and helping those in need. It is a characteristic not just of Stafford, but as the UK as a whole. It's also significant agreement because, as Serco have experienced at their other sites, community support greatly assists the integration into society of those seeking asylum. So against this backdrop, the urgent and pressing need for new asylum seeker accommodation is undeniable. It's the reason why the Home Office designated each local authority a dispersal area for accommodating asylum seekers in April 2022. Each local authority must play its part, including Stafford, by housing asylum seekers at the dispersed accommodation stage of the process up to 0.5% of its population. For Stafford, this means accommodating up to 684 individuals, which cap will certainly not be exceeded if planning permission is granted for Stafford Court. Critically, Mr. Wedderburn accepted in cross-examination that the planning system has a role to play in meeting this need in line with paragraph 124A of the National Planning and Policy Framework, which encourages the efficient use of land, which the appeal scheme is, to meet the identified need for different types of housing. Councillor Beattie also accepted that it was in the public interest that suitable accommodation be found for asylum seekers. Theo Clark, the Member of Parliament for Stafford, cites a figure of 137 as, I quote, an agreed migration number for Stafford. That figure isn't recognised by the appellant nor by the council, and as such it should be disregarded. So I make no apologies for starting with the planning balance. It was and remains common ground that the appeal scheme complies with the development plan as a whole. The significance of this agreement cannot be understated. As Mr. Wedderburn accepted, compliance with the development plan gives rise to both a statutory and a policy presumption in favour of granting planning permission. Section 38(6) of the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 is the source of the statutory presumption, and paragraph 11C of the National Planning Policy Framework enjoins decision makers to grant planning permission, and I underline this and embolden it, without delay. In addition to this presumptive starting point, it's essential that the many significant benefits of this scheme are properly understood and given the appropriate weight. First, it delivers a large part of Stafford's contribution to meeting an urgent, pressing need, and one that is increasing, for asylum accommodation. This should be given substantial weight in the balance. The council will receive a minimum of £1.12 million funding from the Home Office for dispersed accommodation residents. The funding will not be ring-fenced. It's therefore entirely up to the council how this money is spent. The Home Office indicates that it should be spent to mitigate the impact on local services and to provide wraparound care. This could include services that may or may not be affected by an increase in the population. The council could, if it wishes, engage with the local community in deciding how to spend the money. Importantly, there is not a shred of evidence that the council considered this financial support, let alone addressed whether it may have assisted in meeting some of its concerns. Indeed, under cross-examination, Councillor Beattie appeared ignorant of the dispersal grant. Next, new jobs during the refurbishment of the buildings, as well as in the supply chain and the operation of the site. An important economic benefit that should be given significant weight in light of paragraph 81 of the framework, which says significant weight should be placed on the need to support economic growth. The proposal will also bring back into use a building that's been largely vacant for several years. As the appeal scheme requires no demolition, it won't result in a release of embodied carbon. These environmental benefits should be given significant weight. And the reuse of Stafford Court represents, as we've already indicated, an efficient use of land, but importantly, it avoids the need to build new facilities on greenfield sites. So these benefits, along with the statutory and policy presumptions referred to already, tilt the planning balance substantially in favour of the appeal scheme. Our strong submission is that the material considerations relied upon by the council must be compelling in order for it to be dismissed. So can I just pause there, depart from my text for the first time, to note this. Apart from referring to the exponential growth in the numbers of asylum seekers requiring accommodation in their closing submissions, the council does not acknowledge or take into account any of the benefits that I've just identified in our closing, nor in its planning balance section does it seek to weigh any benefits against the material considerations which it relies upon, contrary to the scheme. Thank you, sir. I'm reverting back to text now. Paragraph 12. Before addressing the claim, material considerations relied upon by the council, we must note the fact that Mr. Wedderburn didn't consider any of the benefits listed above, and so that's a similar point to the one I've just made about closing submissions in his evidence, particularly the urgent and pressing need for asylum seeker accommodation. It's no answer to say that this need was already considered by members through their inferential agreement that the appeal scheme met the policy requirement for specialist housing and therefore did not need to be reconsidered. Mr. Wedderburn's role was to assess the merits of the proposal afresh with an independent eye. The fact that he omitted the benefits of the scheme from his planning balance casts a pall over his evidence, and the weight one attaches to it must be reduced. I turn next to the council's material considerations. As we set out in opening, the remaining issues emerge from the single reason for refusal, and they give rise to the following questions. First, whether the fear of crime is a material consideration in the present case, and if so, what weight it should bear. Second, whether the appeal scheme would have an unacceptable effect on social inclusivity. And third, whether the proposals would have an unacceptable impact on local public health resources. The council alleges conflict with two policies in the framework, paragraphs 92A and 130F. After some coaxing and re-examination, Mr. Wedderburn recalled that he also thought the proposal conflicted with paragraph 92C of the framework. That he needed some reminding suggests that the conflict isn't put forward with any great confidence. As set out below, the scheme fully complies with these policies too, and so they don't provide any reason to dismiss the appeal. Finally, before turning to the main issues, there are tests which simply do not apply to the determination of this appeal. Mr. Wedderburn accepted in cross-examination, as he was bound to do, that there is no policy requirement for an alternative site assessment, nor is there any requirement for an assessment of whether an alternative model of asylum seeker accommodation could be possible or might be preferable. The reality is, as Mr. Jackson observed in cross-examination, that the need is so great for asylum accommodation that all three models discussed will be required. In any event, even if the accommodation site model explained in the asylum accommodation fact sheet was relevant and preferable, as Mr. Jackson explained, there are no sites of a similar size or configuration to Scampton, Bexhill or Catterick within Stafford Borough. The essential point is that the time spent cross-examining the appellant about alternative models was wasted. It is simply irrelevant to the merits of the appeal. And so I just note here, particularly in relation to paragraphs 1 to 5 of Maloney Thread's closing submissions, this point is repeated. The existence of other models is, in my submission, irrelevant. So paragraph 16, even if consideration of alternative sites were to be required, then such analysis was done as set out in the design and access statement. No criticism can properly be made of the exercise. It was proportionate to what was required and ensured value for money in the delivery of a government objective. So the question for you, we say, is whether this development accords with the development plan, which it is agreed it does, and whether there are any material considerations that suggest determining the appeal otherwise in accordance with the local plan, which there are not. The availability or consideration of alternative sites or models is not a material consideration in this appeal. Nonetheless, when one does compare the facilities proposed at the larger Home Office schemes with the appeal proposal, recalling that the larger schemes will only accommodate single males in initial accommodation, a form of accommodation that it can be assumed residents would not want in Stafford given their comments, there is no material difference in the facilities and services provided. First, healthcare provision. The appeal scheme, like the larger schemes, will provide healthcare for all of those in initial accommodation. Second, catering facilities. All those housed at Stafford Court will have access to a large kitchen, the minimum size of which is fixed by condition. It will all have all cooking utensils provided. Each cluster will have access to a kitchen, and there is no suggestion that the larger schemes will provide meals, nor is there any attraction to Mr. Rich's argument that catering facilities does not include kitchens. There'll be 24/7 security. There will be provision of transport, as Mr. Dyche said in evidence. If a resident needs transport to access medical or legal meetings, this will be provided. If a resident requires transport because of mobility issues, then this will also be provided, not just for medical and legal appointments. On-site activities, whilst the sheer size of the government MOD sites will undoubtedly offer broad opportunities for recreational activities, the appeal site has an internal courtyard which will be organised so as to offer physical recreation, controlled by condition, together with a multifunctional indoor space, again, controlled by condition. The only real difference is in the number of people accommodated in the larger proposed schemes and that they are located in more rural locations. As discussed in more detail below, one of the Council's criticisms of the appeal proposal is that it doesn't encourage social inclusion. It's surprising then that Councillor Beattie expressed a preference for a significantly larger accommodation model close to a small rural village, which is highly unlikely to foster social integration. The alternative model, pepper potting, Councillor Beattie accepted wasn't viable and so shouldn't be considered as an alternative, even if that were necessary. Incidentally, this was a point agreed by Councillor Trowbridge, who stated that there's not the housing stock to provide accommodation for Staffordshire of asylum seekers, and that it would, in her view, take 7 to 10 years to build these homes. Such a delay would be unacceptable in the context of the pressing need for asylum accommodation now. Of the 3 models proposed by the Council, one is not viable or deliverable in time, and the other is only different from this proposal in terms of the numbers of occupants and its rural location, and there are no facilities large enough in Stafford. Consequently, if consideration of alternative models was material, which it's not, there's nothing to suggest that there's a viable or credible alternative to delivering this Council's contribution to meeting the national requirement for asylum accommodation. So I turn now to the fear of crime. As set out in opening, it's common ground that the fear of crime is capable of being a material consideration. However, there are a series of gateways through which the Council must pass before the fear of crime can be taken into account as a material consideration. The legal test can be distilled as follows and are uncontroversial between the parties. First, the fear of crime must be objectively justified. Second, it must have some reasonable basis. And third, it must relate to the use in planning terms of the land rather than assumptions not supported by evidence as to the characteristics of future occupiers. So I'm going to make a number of points about the correct legal approach. I note in relation to paragraph 36 of the Council's closing submissions that there's an apparent acceptance that the 3 tests set out in my closing submissions and in opening are the correct legal tests or gateways for you to consider and apply. So next, at paragraph 23 of the Council's closing submissions, there's a reference to the Newport Borough Council against the Secretary of State for Wales case. The question arose then as to whether or not the public perception of a danger emanating from a chemical waste treatment plant, which was unsupported by evidence, would be capable of comprising a material consideration. So that was not a surprising conclusion in circumstances where one could reasonably conclude that one of the land use planning consequences of granting permission for a chemical waste treatment plant could be dangerous emanations. But that case is not inconsistent with the West Midlands probation case, nor the Smith case, both of which we refer to in our evidence and which are called documents. And finally, sir, I just ask you to note this point, that the case of Smith, which is the most recent in time of the authorities that the parties rely upon, considers the relevant jurisprudence and sets out very clearly in my submission the appropriate tests. And it's notable that that is a Court of Appeal judgment. So to the extent that there's any inconsistency between the Smith case and other cases at first instance, the Smith case is to be preferred. So that's probably going to be my longest departure. Back to the text 24. It was abundantly clear from the evidence that no part of these tests is met. Mr. Wedderburn very properly agreed in cross-examination that if one of the tests is not passed, then the point overall fails, and the fear of crime should not be a material consideration. Despite setting out the correct approach to assessing whether the fear of crime is a material consideration in his proof of evidence, Mr. Wedderburn went on to reveal a blatant misapplication of it. Referring to allegations of antisocial behaviour at Lowestoft Court, Derby, he said this: irrespective of whether these were accurate and justified allegations, the potential for rising tensions within the local community is clear. Whilst he said in cross-examination that this point was put clumsily, it belied a misunderstanding of the threshold test. This misunderstanding was repeated throughout his evidence, which suggested that it was sufficient for people to be anxious about a proposal in order for the fear of crime to become a material consideration. That is not the test, and must further reduce the weight to be attached to his evidence. Perhaps in recognition of the fact that the relevant legal test could not be satisfied, Mr. Richards sought to stretch the concept beyond breaking point in cross-examination of Mr. Jackson. It was suggested that the reaction of individuals to the appeal scheme could be a material consideration. In other words, if children stopped walking to school, that would undermine policies supporting sustainable travel and public health. And not only was this point not part of the reason for refusal or Mr. Wedderburn's evidence, it's patently wrong and dangerously so. Taken to its logical conclusion, if a person's reaction to a proposed development was a material consideration, it could stymie almost every form of development. The attempts at justification for the alleged fear of crime were delivered passionately, and we have no doubt represented the speaker's views about the alleged risk that asylum seekers posed, but that masked an absence of any supporting evidence or basis in fact. One cannot seek to justify a fear of crime through scaremongering, rumour or conspiracy theory. As the response from the Staffordshire Police characterised the reaction of many people, it was fear of the unknown. Assumptions, unevidenced allegations, or at its very worst, prejudice, do not come close to meeting the test set out above. As we stressed in opening, the police raised no objection to the appeal scheme and rejected the notion that there will be an increase in crime due to the arrival of asylum seekers. The consultation response from the police could not have been clearer. There are some community concerns of the location of the building and the close proximity to Western Road High School, Veritas Primary Academy School, the nursery, as well as St John's Primary Academy. There is no perceived risk to the children or the residents of Stafford. The police and the staff will be able to resolve any concerns if they arise. There is an assumption that there will be an increase in crime and the arrival of refugee asylum centre. There is no evidence to suggest this. This is due to the fear of the unknown. As guardians of public safety and custodians of a wealth of intelligence information, the views of the police